Hello. Um, I have no idea if this is working or not, but currently writing an essay about Goodbye to All That by Joan Didion. It is the last essay that you can find in her collection, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which the titular essay there is probably one of her most famous works. Um, I also have no idea where the stream is going. I hope it's going to the right place. Um, if not, I will stop immediately and feel very silly. Um, um, yeah. Oh, good. It is, I think, going to the right place. Um, Let me play this on my phone to make sure that is, in fact, the case. Anyways, this is a channel called Alex Does Work. It's where I film myself doing work. I don't know if anything will come of this, but at the very least, I can talk to you about one of my favorite pieces of writing, which is called Goodbye to All That. It's by Joan Didion. I read it for the first time about a year and a half ago when I was in London and I was missing New York. And honestly, when I first read it, I was very defensive about it. I remember thinking, uh, it's almost like Didion had said something that offended me, where I was afraid that I was engaging with New York in the way that she does, and you'll see what that is like in just a second. Which is very much one of a tourist, one of someone who is a perpetual visitor, except she just fell in love with the city in a kind of wild whirlwind and was just a visitor for 8 years. I moved my table closer. Um, I think over the years I have come to deeply appreciate this as some of definitely my favorite of Didion's writing. I think I might as well flag this early days. I love Didion. I think she's an excellent writer, and I think at her peak she has just a command of the English language that very few other people do. I do think she is kind of an unquestioned good in, I think, perhaps the pretentious literary circles that I fashion and you might fashion as well. Um, that is to say, I think I have two primary critiques of Didion that are very similar, although distinct. The first, and there's really no other way to put this, is good lord, sometimes she can be really pretentious. She can be really pretentious without any semblance of self-awareness whatsoever. And, I'm very pretentious too. I love Charlie Kaufman movies and Simon and Garfunkel and, living the good life. But good lord, can Didion you read you read Year of Magical Thinking, and then just randomly out of nowhere she'll be like, "Oh well, I was at a dinner party with like X, Y, and Z members of the LA elite," and she just moves on like she didn't just like name drop in front of a bunch of things. Two, and this is a very similar critique, is that David Foster Wallace once said that something that he tries to instill in his students back when he was a teacher was that he doesn't like writing that just tries to prove to you that it's very clever and or that its author is very clever. And I think sometimes Didion falls into that trap. Her writing is very culturally based, and so sometimes that can even make it like age kind of poorly into the modern day, where she'll be referencing like cultural touchstones that probably made sense when she was writing, but probably don't make sense today. And that in and of itself isn't bad at all, but sometimes it just comes across as like her trying to be like, "Trust me, I know exactly what I'm talking about." This piece, though, I think manages to avoid all of that. Never in this piece am I getting the feeling that she's just trying to convince me she's clever. It feels genuinely thoughtful and reflective, and no part of this piece is pretentious, I don't think. It is, like I said, just genuinely someone reflecting on it. My hair is just so chaotic today. Let me push it that way. I don't know. It's just someone reflecting on a time in her life that obviously was very impactful to her. And I think the reason this resonates with so many people is because a lot of people fall in love with New York in the same way she did, and a lot of people are young in New York in the same way she did. And I resent I think part of the reason I didn't like this at first is because I resent the general sentiment that, by the way, is there audio working on this? Let me see. It was very impactful to her. And I think the reason this resonates with so many people. Let me try that, and let me see if that's still working, because that was a sentiment that. By the way, is there audio working? This is going to be a weird moment in the stream where I just see... This is kind of the point of this, though, is to, like, iron out the... Let me try that. And let me see if that's still working, because that was... Perfect. You know what? Without farther ado, let's just jump into this. The point of this is literally just to read Goodbye to All That. That's all I want to do with this. I just want to, before I start writing, before I start even thinking, I have some ideas for where the essay will go, but not really a lot. It's really just to read it out loud and see what resonates with me. Because my biggest concern here is that Didion's writing is so rich, Goodbye to All That in particular is so rich, that I'm just going to keep going down. The essay will be... it'll be too unwieldy. It'll be too ambitious isn't even the right word. It's trying to do too much. I guess ambitious is kind of the right word for that. But I want to make sure, because there's a lot you can do here. There's, I think, just based thinking out loud, there's Didion conveying her love of New York, which I think there's a lot of there, and looking at the devices she does to do that. There is conflating that with being young. There is, of course, the departure from all of that. And I think the key here for this specific essay I'm working on is not to bite off more than I can chew, right? Not to make sure that my paragraphs are not sequentially going through the beats of the essay, because that will be far too much. But instead maybe looking at one beat or one angle and going from there. I don't know how to get my hair correct. I keep pushing it that way. I don't know. We're just going to have to live with whatever this is. Let's read it. Let's read Goodbye to All That, and hopefully you will enjoy it as much as I do, and we'll go from there. Goodbye to All That. It is easy... Oh, whoa. Gotta read the little thing. That's a nursery rhyme, by the way. I didn't know what that was, so I Googled it. And it is a nursery rhyme. It's an English language nursery rhyme, so that's how we start. So let's do that. Ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary pals, here is Goodbye to All That. How many miles to Babylon? 70 miles and 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. If your feet are nimble and light, you can get there by candlelight. It is easy to see the beginning of things and harder to see the ends. I can remember now, with a clarity that makes the nerves in the back of my neck constrict, when New York began for me, but I cannot lay my finger upon the moment it ended, can never cut through the ambiguities and second starts and broken resolves to the exact place on the page where the heroine is no longer as optimistic as she once was. When I first saw New York, I was 20, and it was summertime, and I got off a DC-7 at the old Idlewild temporary terminal in a new dress, which had seemed very smart in Sacramento, but seemed less smart already, even in the old Idlewild temporary terminal, and the warm air smelled of mildew and some instinct programmed by all the movies I had ever seen, and all the songs I had ever sung, and all the stories I had ever read about New York informed me that it would never be quite the same again. In fact, it never was. Sometime later, there was a song on all the jukeboxes in the Upper West Side that went, "But where is the schoolgirl who used to be me?" And if it was late enough at night, I used to wonder that. I know now that almost everyone wonders something like that sooner or later, and no matter what he or she is doing. But one of the mixed blessings of being 20 and 21 and even 23 is the conviction that nothing like this, all evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, has ever happened to anyone before. What a brilliant sentence. Good Lord. Of course, it might have been some other city, had circumstances been different, and the time been different, and had I been different. Might it have been Paris or Chicago or even San Francisco? But because I am talking about myself, and I am talking here about New York. Let me try that line again. But because I am talking about myself, I am talking here about New York. That first night, I opened my window on the bus into the town and watched for the skyline, but all I could see were the wastes of Queens and the big signs that said Midtown Tunnel this lane, and then a flood of summer rain. Even that seemed remarkable and exotic, for I had come out of the West where there was no summer rain. So true, Didion. And for the next 3 days, I sat wrapped in blankets in a hotel room, air conditioned to 35 degrees, and tried to get over a bad cold and a high fever. It did not occur to me to call a doctor because I knew none. And although it did occur to me to call the desk and ask that the air condition be turned off, I never called because I did not know how much to tip whoever might come. Was anyone ever so young? I am here to tell you that someone was. Oh, it's beautiful. All I could do during those 3 days was talk long distance to the boy I already knew I was going to marry in the spring. I would stay in New York, I told him, just 6 months, and I could see the Brooklyn Bridge from my window. As it turned out, the bridge was the Triborough, and I stayed 8 years. Good Lord, is that incredible. It makes, as a digression, I remember the first time I was in New York. I understand why people find this insufferable, by the way. How people talk about New York like it's the only city and whatever. But I remember when I'm gonna keep going anyway. It's Didion. Of course, it's insufferable. That's price of admission. I remember the first time I was in New York, and I remember the first time I got sick in New York. Because whenever I get sick, my mental health goes, and that's a leading indicator for whether or not I'm sick. I don't know why. I think you can actually look this up. This is like an actual thing where like your brain releases chemicals when it's sick that just makes it like just out of it. Like sad. And I remember sitting, remember because this was over COVID, and I got the J&J COVID vaccine. And I don't think it was the side effects of the vaccine. I think what happened was I got COVID like a week before, but I didn't know it. And I got the vaccine, and so I got the side effects and I was actually experiencing COVID because the vaccine needs time to kick in. And so I was ridiculously sick. I remember like door dashing Panera, even though it was down the block, because I literally could not get out of bed, and I needed bread, like I needed sustenance. And I remember sitting there and being just so emotional. And to quote Frank O'Hara, "The city accepts me, foolish and free." So let's keep going. In retrospect, it seems to me that those days before I knew the names of all the bridges were happier than the ones that came later, but perhaps you will see that as we go along. Part of what I want to tell you is that what it is like to be young in New York, how 6 months can become 8 years with the deceptive ease of a film dissolve. Beautiful. Snaps. For that is how those years appear to me now, in a long sequence of sentimental dissolves and old-fashioned trick shots, the Seagram Building's fountains dissolving into snowflakes. Oh my god. And I enter the revolving door at 20, and I come out a good deal older and on a different street. But most particularly, I want to explain to you, and in the process perhaps to myself, why I no longer live in New York. It is often said that New York is a city only for the very rich and the very poor. It is less often said that New York is also, at least for those of us who came there from somewhere else, a city only for the very young. I remember once, one cold, bright December evening in New York, suggesting to a friend who complained of having been around too long that try that line again. I remember once, one cold, bright December evening in New York, suggesting to a friend who complained of having been around too long that he come with me to a party where there would be, I assured him with the bright resourcefulness of 23, new faces. We did it. He laughed literally until he choked. And I had to roll down the taxi window and hit him on the back. New faces, he said. Don't tell me about new faces. It seemed that the last time he had gone to a party where he had been promised new faces, there had been 15 people in the room, and he had already slept with 5 of the women and owed money to all but 2 of the men. I laughed with him, but the first snow had just begun to fall, and the big Christmas trees glittered yellow and white as far as I could see up Park Avenue, and I had a new dress, and it would be a very long while before I would come to understand the particular moral of this story. Oh my fucking god. There might be something to say in the essay, to digress, there might be something to say about the run-on sentences here, because there's a lot of them, as you'll see. We've countered, I think, 2 really big unholy ones that, one of them was right there, and then another one was this beautiful one up here. But it just creates this conversational sort of stream of consciousness thought. What she's doing in this essay, and I think what makes it so powerful, is she's using the narrative as a way to cope with her own leaving of New York. And she is fully self-aware of this. She admits this quite plainly. I forget where, but we just read it, which was But most importantly, I want to explain to you, and in the process, perhaps to myself, why I no longer live in New York. I know this is a weird comparison, but it kind of reminds me of the album "A Crow Looked at Me" by Phil Elverum, and it's a very similar thing where it's his wife just passed away of cancer, and it's him reconciling with this. And I think for part of what makes that album so powerful, it's one of my favorite albums of all time. It's deeply sad. It's terribly sad. Don't listen to it unless you want to cry. But part of what that makes that album so powerful is that it's clearly him coping with his wife's death in real time. And I think that's part of what makes this really powerful too, where she's really living through it. And by living through it, she's not living through New York. That's happened in retrospect, right? She's living through coping with the nostalgia and trying to figure out why exactly she left. And of course, if you're kind of coping through something in real time, it makes sense to have these like really long run-on sentences where she bounces from detail to detail, almost like she's trying to convince herself of what she's saying, but not in a way that seems deceptive, in a way that's like, I'm just processing all of this and I need to think about it. And so let's keep reading and, note that as I keep going. Is anyone watching this? I think it'd be really funny if anyone watches this. Oh, good. No one's watching this. There's one viewer, and that's probably just me. Anyways, let's keep going. It would be a long while because, quite simply, I was in love with New York. I do not mean love in any colloquial way. I mean that I was in love with the city, the way you love the first person who ever touches you and never love anyone quite that way again. I remember walking across stop snapping. I remember walking across 62nd Street one twilight, that first spring, or the second spring. They were all alike for a while. I was late to meet someone, but I stopped at Lexington Avenue and bought a peach and stood there on a corner eating it and knew that I had come out of the west and reached the mirage. I could taste the peach and feel the soft air blowing from a subway grating on my legs, and I could smell lilac and garbage and expensive perfume, and I knew that it would cost something sooner or later because I did not belong there, did not come from there. But when you are 22 or 23, you figure that later you will have a high emotional balance and be able to pay whatever it costs. I still believed in possibilities then, still had the sense so peculiar to New York that something extraordinary would happen any minute, any day, any month. I was making only $65, $70 a week then. Put yourself in Hattie Carnegie's hands, I was advised without the slightest trace of irony by an editor of a magazine for which I had worked. So little money that some weeks I had to charge food at Bloomingdale's gourmet shop in order to eat, a fact that went unmentioned in the letters I wrote to California. I never told my father that I needed money because then he would have sent it and I would have never known that I could do it by myself. Oh my God, Jesus. At that time, making a living seemed like a game to me, with arbitrary but quite inflexible rules. And except on a certain kind of winter evening, a 6:30 in the 70s, say, already dark and bitter, with a wind off the river, when I would be walking very fast towards a bus and would look in the bright windows of brownstones and see cooks working in clean kitchens and imagine women lighting candles on the floor above and beautiful children being bathed on the floor above that. Except on nights like those, I never felt poor. I had the feeling that if I needed money, I could always get it. I could write a syndicated column for teenagers under the name Debbie Lynn, or I could smuggle gold into India, or I could become a $100 call girl and none of it would matter. Nothing was irrevocable. Everything was in reach. Just around every corner lay something curious and interesting, something I had never seen or done or known about. I could go to a party and meet someone who'd called himself Mr. Emotional Appeal and ran the Emotional Appeal Institute, or Tina Onassis Blandford, or Florida Cracker, who was then a regular on what he called the Big C, the Southampton El Morocco Circuit. I am well connected on the Big C, he would tell me over collard greens on his vast borrowed terrace. Or the window of the Celery King of the Harlem Market, or a piano salesman from Bon Tier, Missouri. That's where I am. Or someone who had already made and lost 2 fortunes in Midland, Texas. I could make promises to myself and to other people, and there would be all the time in the world to keep them. I could stay up all night and make mistakes, and none of it would count. You see, I was in a curious position in New York. It never occurred to me that I was living a real life there. In my imagination, I was always just there for a few months, just until Christmas or Easter or the first warm day in May. For that reason, I was most comfortable in the company of Southerners. They seemed to be in New York as I was, on some indefinitely extended leave from wherever they belonged, disinclined to consider the future, temporary exiles who always knew when the flights left for New Orleans or Memphis or Richmond, or in my case, California. Someone who always lives with a plane schedule in the drawer, lives on a slightly different calendar. Christmas, for example, was a difficult season. Other people could take it in stride, going to Stowe or going abroad or going for the day to their mother's places in Connecticut. Those of us who believed that we lived somewhere else would spend it making and canceling airline reservations, waiting for the weather-browned flights as if for the last plane out of Lisbon in 1940. And finally comforting one another, those of us who were left with the oranges and mementos and smoked oyster stuffings of childhood, gathering close, colonials in a far country, which is precisely what we were. I am not sure that it is possible for anyone to bring up in the East, let me try that line again, which is precisely what we were. I am not sure that it is possible for anyone brought up in the East to appreciate entirely what New York, the idea of New York, means to those of us who came from the West and the South. Quick pause here. This is another reason I didn't like this essay on first read, or I pushed back against it, which was that, one, she claims that it's a city only for the really young, and then totally, that goes completely unsubstantiated. She just drops it in like it's supposed to be some, like, novel fact or something, and it is, I think, fully unsupported. There's plenty of people who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s who live in New York. I know many of them. I've met my friends' parents, they're still there. They haven't left. Maybe that says something about them, but I mean, it's not exclusively a city for the very young. And two is she definitely speaks on behalf of large groups in this. One of them is, of course, young people, and another one is people from the West to the South, right? This is making a very grand, sweeping statement, and maybe you do or don't agree with that, but I don't know. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I think now I'm a little less critical of that, but let's keep going. To an Eastern child, particularly a child who had always had an uncle on Wall Street and who spent several hundred Saturdays first at FAO Schwartz and being fitted for shoes at Best's, and then waiting under the Biltmore clock and dancing to Lester Lannon, New York is just a city, albeit the city, a plausible place for people to live. But to those of us who came from places where no one had heard of Lester Lannon and Grand Central Station Let me try that line again. And Grand Central Station was a Saturday radio program where Wall Street and Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue were not places but abstractions, money and high fashion and the hucksters. What a great sentence. New York was no mere city. It was instead an infinitely romantic notion, the mysterious nexus of all love and money and power, the shining imperishable dream itself. To think of living there was not to reduce the miraculous to the mundane. One does not live. Let me try that line again. To think of living there was to reduce the miraculous to the mundane. One does not live at Xanadu. In fact, it was difficult in the extreme for me to understand those young women for whom New York was not simply an ephemeral, not going to try to pronounce that, but a real place, Estoril? But a real place. Girls who bought toasters and installed new cabinets in their apartment and committed themselves to some reasonable future. I never bought any furniture in New York. For a year or so, I lived in other people's apartments. After that, I lived in the 90s in an apartment furnished entirely with things taken from storage by a friend whose wife had moved away. And when I left the apartment in the 90s, that was when I was leaving everything, when it was all breaking up, I left everything in it. Even my winter clothes and a map of Sacramento County I had hung on the bedroom wall to remind me who I was, and I moved into a mosaic 4-room floor through on 75th Street. Pause here. Even though I'm butchering this every other line, which is, I'm sure, a really enjoyable experience to read, you can understand now why I want to read this out loud. And it's because of these, unholy run-on sentences and these, stream of consciousness sort of things. Oh no, is it going to start raining? Oh, god damn it. I gotta go get groceries in like 10 minutes. Whatever. I should not fear the rain. I should be one with the rain. But you can see why I want to read the... I don't know what that was. You can see why I want to read this out, right? Because it's not conversational. I wouldn't describe it as that. But it is stream of consciousness. It is someone who is throwing every detail that stands out to her out and saying this all... It's like a detective putting together pieces from the slop, thinking, this is all I can remember, and all of it feels relevant, and I know some of it is relevant, and I'm trying to use this to help myself reconcile with my decision. Almost like a therapy session where you're like just streaming everything out. Yeah. Let's keep going. Montastic. I don't know what that means, or why I said it like that. Well, I need a monk's. Montastic is perhaps misleading here, implying some chic severity. Until after I was married and my husband moved some furniture in, there was nothing at all in those 4 rooms except a cheap double mattress and box springs ordered by telephone the day I decided to move, and 2 French garden chairs lent to me by a friend who imported them. It strikes me now that the people I knew in New York had curious and self-defeating sidelines. They all imported garden chairs, which did not sell very well at... I'm not going to try. Or they tried to market hair straighteners in Harlem, or they ghosted exposés of Murder Incorporated for Sunday supplements. I think that perhaps none of us were very serious. Engage only about our most private lives. There we go. All I ever did to that apartment was hang 50 yards of yellow theatrical silk across the bedroom windows because I had some idea that the gold light would make me feel better, but I did not bother to weigh the curtains correctly, and all that summer the long panels of transparent golden silk would blow out the windows and get tangled and drenched in the afternoon thunderstorms. That was the year, my 28th, when I was discovering that not all the promises would be kept. That some things are in fact very irrevocable. I think that was right. Irrevocable, and that it had counted after all. Every evasion and every procrastination, every mistake, every word, all of it. Good Lord. That is what it was all about, right? I'm going to make my little screen a little bit bigger here. There I am, so you can see me. That is what it was all about, wasn't it? Promises. Now when New York comes back to me, it comes in hallucinatory flashes. So clinically detailed that I sometimes wish that memory would affect the distortion with which it is commonly credited. Let me try that line again, because I feel like it's relevant. That is what it was all about, wasn't it? Promises. Now when New York comes back to me, it comes in hallucinatory flashes, so clinically detailed that I sometimes wish that memory would affect the distortion with which it is commonly credited. What does that mean? Seems relevant, though. Not sure. Let me know in the chat. I'll become a streamer. I'll be like, yeah, guys, let me know in the chat. Riveting chat. For a lot of the time I was in New York, I used a perfume called Florida, French. And now that slightest trace of either can short-circuit my connections for the rest of the day. Nor can I smell Henry Bendel jasmine soap without falling back into the past or the particular mixture of spices used for boiling crabs. There were barrels of crab boils in a Czech place in the 80s. Where I once shopped. Smells, of course, are notorious memory stimuli, but there are other things which affect me in some way. Blue and white striped sheets, vermouth cases, some faded nightgowns which were new in 1959 or 1960, and some chiffon scarves I bought about the same time. I suppose that a lot of us who have been young in New York have the same scenes on our home screens. I remember sitting in a lot of apartments with a slight headache about 5 o'clock in the morning. I had a friend who could not sleep, and he knew few other people who had the same trouble. And we would watch the sky lighten and have a last drink with no ice, and then go home in the morning light when the streets were clean and wet. Had it rained in the night? We never knew. and a few cruising taxis still had their headlights on, and the only color was red and the green of traffic signals. The White Rose bars opened very early in the morning. I recall waiting in one of them to watch an astronaut go into space, waiting so long that at the moment it actually happened, I had my eyes not on the television screen, but on a cockroach on the tile floor. I liked the bleak branches above Washington Square at dawn, and the monochromatic flatness of 2nd Avenue, the fire escapes, and the grilled storefronts, peculiar and empty in their perspective. It is relatively hard to fight at 6:30 or 7 in the morning without any sleep, which was perhaps one reason we stayed up all night. And it seemed to me a pleasant time of day. The windows were shuttered in that apartment in the 90s, and I could sleep a few hours and then go to work. I could work then on 2 or 3 hours of sleep and a container of coffee from chock full of nuts. I liked going to work, liked the soothing and satisfactory rhythm of getting out a magazine, liked the orderly progression of 4-color closings and 2-color closings, and black and white closings, and then the product, and no abstraction, but something which looked effortlessly glossy and could be picked up on a newsstand and weighed in the hand. Yes, oh. I liked that all the minutiae of proofs and layouts, liked working late on the nights, and the magazine went to press, sitting and reading Variety and waiting for the copy desk to call. Jesus. From my office, I could look across town to the weather signal and the Mutual of New York building and the lights that alternatively spelled out time and life above Rockefeller Plaza. That pleased me obscurely. And so did walking uptown the Maeve 8 o'clocks of early summer evenings and looking at things low-stoffed turns in 57th Street windows, people in evening clothes trying to get taxis, the trees just coming into full leaf, and the lambent air, all the sweet promises of money and summer. Some years passed, but I still did not lose that sense of wonder about New York. I began to cherish the loneliness of it, the sense that at any given time, no one needs to know where I was or what I was doing. I liked walking from the East River over to the Hudson and back on brisk days, down around the village on warm days. A friend would leave me a key to her apartment in the West Village when she was out of town, and sometimes I would just move down there, because by that time the telephone was beginning to bother me. The canker, you see, was already in the rows. That's some language. And not many people had that number. I remember one day when someone who did have the West Village number came to pick me up for lunch there, and we both had hangovers, and I cut my finger opening him a beer and burst into tears, and we walked into a Spanish restaurant and drank Bloody Marys and gazpacho until we felt better. I was not then guilt-ridden about spending afternoons that way, because I still had all the afternoons in the world. And even then, late in the game, I still liked going to parties, all parties, bad parties, Saturday afternoon parties given by recently married couples who lived in Stuyvesant, West Side parties given by unpublished or failed writers who served cheap red wine and talked about going to Guadalajara, village parties where all the guests worked for advertising agencies and voted for Reform Democrats, press parties at Sardi's, the worst kind of parties. You will have perceived by now that I was not one to profit by the experience of others, that it was a very long time indeed before I stopped believing in new faces and began to understand the lesson of the story, which is that it is distinctly possible to stay too long at the fair. I could not tell you when I began to understand that. All I know is that it was very bad when I was 28. Everything that was said to me I seemed to have heard before, and I could no longer listen. I could no longer sit in little bars near Grand Central and listen to someone complaining about his wife's inability to cope with the help while he missed another train to Connecticut. I no longer had any interest in hearing about the advances other people had received from their publishers, about plays which were having second act trouble in Philadelphia, or about people I would like very much if only I would come out and meet them. That's a bar. I had already met them anyways. I could not bear Upper Madison Avenue on weekday mornings. This was a particularly inconvenient aversion because I lived just 50 or 60 feet east of Madison, and because I would see women walking Yorkshire Terriers and shopping at a fancy store, and some, not going to try that one, gorge would rise in my throat. I could not go to Times Square in the afternoon or go to the New York Public Library for any reason whatsoever. Oh, you're missing out, Didion. One day I could not go into a Schraff's. The next day it would be the Bonwit Teller. I hurt the people I care. I hurt the people I cared about and insulted those I did not. I cut myself off from the one person who was closer to me than any other. Pretty sure this describes Francis Ha. I cried until I cried until I was not even aware when I was crying, and when I was not, cried in elevators and in taxis and in Chinese laundromats. And when I went to the doctor, he said that I seemed to be depressed and should see a specialist. He wrote down a psychiatrist's name and an address for me, but I did not go. Instead, I got married, which, as it turns out, was a very good thing to do, but very badly timed. Danny, are you here? Oh, no, I guess just something else fell down back there. I didn't think so. Yeah. I wonder what that was. I had never before understood what despair meant, and I am not sure that I can understand now, but I understood that year. Of course I could not work. I could not even get dinner with any degree of certainty, and I would sit in the apartment on 75th Street paralyzed until my husband would call from his office and say gently that I did not have to get dinner, that I could meet him at Michael's Pub, or at Toots Shore, or at Sardi's East. And then one morning in April, we had been married in January, he called me and told me that he wanted to get out of New York for a while, that he would take a 6-month leave of absence, and that we would go somewhere. It was 3 years ago he told me that, and we had lived in Los Angeles since. Many of the people we knew in New York think this to be a curious aberration, and in fact tell us so. There is no adequate answer to that. Let me try that again. There is no adequate answer to that, and so we give certain stock answers, the answers that everyone gives. I talk about how difficult it would be for us to afford to live in New York right now, about how much space we need. All lies we tell ourselves. All I mean is that I was very young in New York, and that at some point the golden rhythm was broken, and I am not that young anymore. The last time I was in New York was in a cold January when everyone was ill and tired. Many of the people I'd used to know there had moved to Dallas or had gone to Antabooz or bought a farm in New Hampshire. Oh, that's the dream. We stayed Vermont, though. We stayed 10 days, and then we took an afternoon flight back to Los Angeles. And on the way home from the airport that night, I could see the moon on the Pacific and smell jasmine all around, and we both knew that there was no longer any point in keeping the apartment we still kept in New York. There were years when I called Los Angeles the coast, but they seem so long ago. That eats. That rocks. Good Lord. That was so good. I have to go now. I'm going to stop this stream. I have to go now. And it's because I have to go get groceries and like do a bunch of errands and stuff. And I also want to do that before it starts raining, which I guess is imminent. But reading through it, there's a few things I do want to... It's worth being late to that so I can like flag a few of my... like starting just like initial, not even initial thoughts because I've read this before, but my thoughts on this, which is to say, it's not really a story about New York, right? I mean, like, it's a love story, but love stories usually tell us much more about ourselves than they do about the people we are in love with, right? What the hell is that? Apple does this now. It automatically detects when I'm like giving a thumbs up. Has this been doing this the whole time? Have I been reading Didion with just... I think if you do two of them, it's like a whole thing. This is what the smartest minds of our generation are doing. They're in Cupertino programming whatever this is. I digress. There was a quote... First of all, the smartest minds of our generation quote from... That was from Howell, right? Or is it from Ginsberg originally? It was the best minds of my generation, and it was from Ginsberg. And that's how that long poem starts. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. Yeah. I was just reading a book where... Hi, Amy. I'm live streaming to an audience of 0 while I read... I'm live streaming to an audience of 0 while I read Goodbye to All That by Joan Didion. I don't know, I just felt like doing it.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm doing well. I'm actually about to... Let me stop streaming, I guess. Well, no, because I'm about to leave.